The stallion's hooves struck the fence post with such force that splinters exploded into the November air like shrapnel. Abigail watched from the cabin window, her coffee growing cold in trembling hands. This was the horse that had put 5 trainers in the hospital. This was the land everyone said was cursed, and this was the only place she had left to go. Before we dive into Abigail's story, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt so desperate that you'd risk everything, even your safety, just to find peace? Because that's exactly what happened when this widow encountered a wild stallion that everyone feared. If you've ever made a choice that terrified you but felt like the only option, drop a comment below with your city. I read every single one. And if you're here for stories about courage, survival, and unexpected redemption, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe where this journey takes us. Now let me tell you how it all began. The lawyer's voice had been clinical, detached. Mrs. Fletcher, the property your late husband inherited from his uncle is, well, it's not what anyone would call desirable. It's been abandoned for 12 years. There's a cabin, barely habitable, and there's the matter of the horse. Abigail had signed the papers anyway. What choice did she have? Philip had been dead 3 months, the medical bills had consumed their savings, and the mortgage company had already placed a foreclosure notice on their family home in Portland. She was 62 years old, with $340 in her bank account, and nowhere to go. The property was 4 hours southeast, deep in the high desert country of Oregon, where the land stretched out in endless waves of sage and juniper. The kind of place where silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence, thick and suffocating. Philip's uncle, a man she'd met only twice at family gatherings, had been a horse trainer, a brilliant one according to the stories. He'd worked with some of the finest thoroughbreds and quarter horses on the West Coast. But he'd died alone in that cabin 12 years ago, and the property had sat untouched ever since, tied up in probate disputes and family arguments that Abigail had never fully understood. The horse, a wild Mustang stallion Philip's uncle had captured from the high desert with dreams of breaking him, had been left behind, too dangerous to transport, too valuable to euthanize, too wild to sell. The neighboring rancher, a man named Clifford, had been feeding him out of some mixture of pity and obligation, tossing hay over the fence twice a week and maintaining the water trough. 5 people had tried to do something with that horse over the years. 5 trainers, each with impressive credentials and unshakable confidence. The first had walked away with a shattered collarbone, the second, 3 broken ribs. The third had been hospitalized for a week with a severe concussion. The fourth lost the use of 2 fingers when the stallion had pinned his hand against the fence. The fifth, a woman from California with a reputation for rehabilitating impossible horses, had lasted exactly 11 minutes before the stallion kicked her so hard she'd flown 6 feet through the air and landed in a heap of broken bones and crushed pride. After that, everyone agreed. The horse was beyond saving. Better to leave him alone and let nature take its course. That was 3 years ago. The stallion was still there, still wild, still untouched. Abigail loaded everything she owned into her 12-year-old Honda Civic. 3 suitcases of clothes, a box of photographs, Philip's favorite coffee mug, and her grandmother's quilt. The Portland apartment she'd been renting month to month had already found a new tenant. Her daughter, Carolyn, who lived in Boston with her own family, had offered to let her move in, but the thought of being a burden, of watching her grandchildren walk on eggshells around their grieving grandmother, felt worse than any isolation. The drive took 6 hours, 2 hours longer than it should have because she got lost twice on unmarked county roads. When she finally pulled up to the property, the November sun was setting behind the rimrock, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked almost artificial. The cabin was worse than she'd imagined. The porch sagged on one side. Several windows were cracked or missing entirely, covered with rotting plywood. The roof had lost shingles in patches, exposing tar paper underneath. Sagebrush had grown up around the foundation, and a tumbleweed had wedged itself against the front door. But it was the corral that drew her attention. A massive structure built from railroad ties and thick wooden posts, it occupied nearly an acre behind the cabin. And standing in the center, absolutely still except for the occasional flick of his tail, was the horse. He was enormous, at least 16 hands high, maybe more. His coat was the color of charred wood, a dark, smoky black with undertones of gray. His mane hung long and tangled, filled with burrs and bits of desert grass. And his eyes, even from a distance, held something that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. Not wildness, not rage, recognition, as if he'd been waiting for someone, as if he knew exactly why she'd come. The first night in the cabin, Abigail didn't sleep at all. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, the scratch of mice in the ceiling, the distant howl of coyotes, and underneath it all, the occasional heavy thud of hooves against hard-packed earth. The cabin had electricity, but no heating beyond a wood stove that hadn't been cleaned in over a decade. The water pump worked, but the pipes rattled and groaned like something was dying inside them. There was a propane refrigerator that sputtered to life when she flipped the switch, and a kitchen table with 2 chairs, one of which had a broken leg propped up with a stack of moldy paperbacks. She spent that first night wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, sitting at the table staring out the window at the corral. Moonlight turned everything silver. The stallion stood near the water trough, his massive head lowered, perfectly still. He looked like a statue, a monument to something wild and untamable. When dawn finally broke, Abigail ventured outside for the first time. The cold hit her immediately. High desert cold, the kind that comes from dry air and elevation, sharp and clean. Her breath clouded in front of her face as she walked the perimeter of the property, taking inventory. The tool shed still contained equipment, ropes, halters, a collection of bridles and bits hanging on rusty nails, several saddles in various states of decay. Everything covered in years of dust and bird droppings. There was a chicken coop, long empty, its wire mesh torn and flapping in the breeze. And there was the corral. Up close, she could see the damage. Sections of the fence bore deep gouges where the stallion had kicked. One post had been nearly splintered through, but somehow still held. The gate, a massive thing built from welded steel, showed dents and scratches that spoke of countless attempts to escape. The horse watched her approach. He didn't move, but his ears swiveled forward, tracking her every step. When she reached the fence, still a good 20 feet from where he stood, he finally lifted his head fully. She'd never been particularly interested in horses. Philip had been the animal lover. He'd grown up on a farm, knew how to handle livestock, could fix a fence or birth a calf without breaking a sweat. Abigail had grown up in the suburbs of Sacramento, daughter of an accountant and a librarian. Her experience with animals extended to the family cat and the goldfish her children had won at a county fair. But standing there looking at this creature that had hurt 5 trained professionals, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not intimidation, kinship. This horse was alone, abandoned, left to survive in circumstances no one had chosen for him. And maybe, just maybe, there was something honest about that, something she understood on a level she couldn't quite articulate. Clifford arrived around noon, driving a battered pickup truck with hay bales stacked in the bed. He was in his 70s, weathered and lean, with eyes that had seen too many hard seasons. He'd been feeding the stallion for years, never expecting compensation, never asking questions. "You're braver than you look," he said when Abigail introduced herself. "Most folks won't even set foot on this property." "I don't have anywhere else to go," she replied, and the honesty of it hung between them like a flag of surrender. Clifford showed her how he fed the horse, backing the truck to the fence, cutting the twine on the hay bales, and tossing flakes over the top rail from a safe distance. The stallion never approached while Clifford was there. He'd wait until the truck pulled away, then move to the hay with deliberate slowness, as if accepting charity wounded his pride. "Name's Phantom," Clifford said. "Your husband's uncle named him that. Said he was like a ghost, there but not there, visible but untouchable." "Did you know him?" Philip's uncle? Clifford nodded. Bernard, good man, stubborn as hell. Thought he could gentle any horse that ever lived. Phantom proved him wrong. Bernard spent 3 years trying. The horse never let him within 10 feet. Why didn't Bernard just let him go? Release him back to the wild? Clifford's expression darkened. Tried to. Twice. Phantom came back both times, stood outside that corral and waited until Bernard opened the gate. It's like... He paused, searching for words. It's like the horse knows he belongs here but can't accept being tamed. So he's stuck in this in-between place. Not free, not domesticated, just existing. After Clifford left, Abigail spent the afternoon trying to make the cabin livable. She swept out years of accumulated dust and debris. She cleaned the windows, the ones that weren't broken, until they were clear enough to see through properly. She found a ladder in the shed and climbed onto the roof to assess the damage, discovering it wasn't as bad as it looked. Most of the missing shingles were clustered in one section, and there were spare shingles stacked behind the shed, still wrapped in plastic. She'd never done any kind of construction or repair work in her life, but she had YouTube on her phone and just enough cell signal to load videos. By sunset, she'd managed to replace 6 shingles. Her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, but she'd done it. That night, she made herself a simple dinner, canned soup heated on the propane stove, and sat at the table, eating while watching Phantom through the window. He'd finished the hay Clifford had brought and now stood near the far corner of the corral, his dark shape barely visible against the deepening sky. I don't know what I'm doing here, she said aloud, her voice strange in the empty cabin. I don't know how to fix this place. I don't know how to survive out here, and I definitely don't know what to do about you. The horse didn't react. Of course he didn't. He was 50 yards away behind thick wooden walls. But Abigail kept talking anyway, because the silence was worse, because she needed to hear a human voice, even if it was just her own. Because for the first time since Philip's funeral, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a reason to keep going. We're quite a pair, aren't we? She whispered. Both of us stuck somewhere we didn't choose. Both of us too stubborn to give up. Both of us completely alone. Days blurred into weeks. Abigail developed a routine because routine was the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. Wake at dawn, make coffee on the propane stove, sit at the table and watch Phantom as the sun rose over the rimrock, work on repairs until lunch. Rest during the afternoon heat. Even in November, the desert sun could be brutal. More repairs until dinner. Then evening at the window, watching the horse until darkness made him invisible. She learned things about solitude she'd never known before. How it could be both oppressive and liberating. How the absence of conversation could make you hear your own thoughts so loudly they felt like shouts. How you could go days without speaking and then suddenly find yourself narrating everything you did just to break the silence. The repairs progressed slowly. She fixed the porch steps using lumber she found in the shed and nails that were probably older than she was. She patched the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Not pretty, but functional. She cleaned out the wood stove and got it working, which made the cabin tolerably warm at night. Clifford came twice a week with hay. Sometimes he'd stay for a few minutes, sharing local gossip or offering advice about surviving the desert winter. He never asked why she didn't leave. Maybe he understood that some people ran out of places to run. One morning in early December, Abigail woke to find Phantom standing directly against the fence closest to the cabin. He'd never done that before. Usually, he maintained his distance, claiming the far reaches of the corral as his territory. She approached the window slowly, coffee mug in hand. The stallion's head was turned toward the cabin, ears forward, absolutely still. Watching, waiting. For what? On impulse, she grabbed a jacket and walked outside. The cold bit through her clothes immediately. It had dropped below freezing overnight, and frost coated everything in a delicate layer of white. Her breath came in clouds as she crossed the yard toward the corral. Phantom didn't move. Even as she reached the fence, even as she stood there separated from him by only 3 rails of wood, he held his position. This close, she could see details she'd missed from the window. the scars on his hide, evidence of battles fought in the wild, the intelligent depth in his dark eyes, the slight twitching of his nostrils as he caught her scent. "Hi," she said softly. It felt ridiculous talking to a horse, but no more ridiculous than talking to herself in an empty cabin. "I'm Abigail. I guess we're neighbors now." The stallion's ear flicked. Nothing else changed. "I know you've been through a lot," she continued. "I know people have hurt you, tried to control you, tried to break you into something you're not." She paused, gripping the cold wood of the fence rail. "I understand that, more than you know." She told him about Philip, about the 40 years of marriage that had been good, not perfect, but good. About the cancer diagnosis that had come 2 years ago, sudden and devastating. About watching the man she loved deteriorate, becoming someone she barely recognized. About the medical bills, the bankruptcy, the constant fear. "Everyone kept saying I was so strong," she whispered, "so brave. They kept telling me how well I was handling everything, but I wasn't. I was breaking apart. I just got good at hiding it." Phantom took a single step closer, just one, but it was the first time he'd voluntarily moved toward a human in years. Abigail felt tears on her face and realized she was crying. When had that started? "I'm sorry," she said, laughing bitterly. "Here I am, dumping all my problems on you. You've got your own issues." She turned to leave, to retreat back to the cabin and the safety of solitude. But something made her stop, some instinct she didn't recognize. She looked back at Phantom. "I'm not going to try to tame you," she said. "I'm not going to try to ride you or break you or make you into something you're not. I need you to know you're not alone here, whatever that's worth." That afternoon, she started making changes to her routine. After her morning coffee, she'd walk to the fence with an apple or a carrot, things Clifford had mentioned horses liked. She wouldn't try to feed Phantom directly. She'd just leave the offering on a fence post and walk away. For 3 days, the food sat untouched until nightfall, when coyotes or other scavengers would claim it. On the 4th day, she watched from the window as Phantom approached the fence post, sniffed the apple she'd left there, and ate it in 3 massive bites. It was such a small thing, meaningless, probably, but it felt like victory. She started talking to him every morning, not trying to get close, not trying to touch him or force any interaction, just talking. About the weather, about the repairs she was planning, about memories of her children when they were young. Sometimes she'd read to him. She'd found a box of books in the cabin, mostly westerns and mystery novels, and she'd sit on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and read aloud, while Phantom stood in the corral, listening or not listening. She couldn't tell. 1 week before Christmas, a storm rolled in from the northwest. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours, and snow began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque snow of Christmas cards, but hard-driven snow that came horizontally on winds strong enough to rattle the cabin windows. Abigail watched the storm build with growing anxiety. The weather forecast on her phone, when she could get signal, warned of blizzard conditions, possible power outages, dangerous cold. She had enough propane for heat and cooking. She had food. She'd be fine. But Phantom had no shelter. The corral was completely exposed to the elements. As the storm intensified, she watched him through the window. He'd positioned himself in the corner of the corral that offered the most protection from the wind, but he was still fully exposed to the snow and cold. She couldn't stand it. She grabbed her jacket, pulled on boots, and headed out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her over. Snow stung her face like needles. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her, but she pushed forward to the shed, where she'd seen tarps and rope among the tools. Working in conditions that would have seemed impossible an hour ago, she managed to string a tarp from the shed to one corner of the corral, creating a crude but functional windbreak. Her fingers went numb, her face burned with cold, but she kept working. When she finished and stumbled back to the cabin, shaking with cold and exhaustion, she looked back at the corral. Phantom had moved. He was standing under the tarp, protected from the worst of the wind and snow. And he was looking directly at the cabin, directly at her window. Christmas came and went unmarked, except for a phone call from Carolyn. who worried and prodded and finally accepted that her mother was by some miracle okay. Abigail didn't tell her daughter about the loneliness that sometimes felt like drowning. She didn't mention the nights when she'd wake in panic, convinced she'd heard Philip calling her name. She didn't talk about the crushing weight of having outlived the life she'd built. Instead, she talked about the repairs she'd completed, about the beauty of the desert winter, about the resourcefulness she'd discovered in herself. All true, just not the whole truth. January brought new challenges. A pipe burst in the bathroom, flooding the floor before she discovered it. She spent an entire day watching YouTube videos on plumbing repair, then another day implementing what she'd learned with varying degrees of success. The repair held mostly. The propane tank ran low. Clifford helped her arrange a delivery, but it cost more than she'd budgeted. Money was becoming a real problem. Her social security checks barely covered basic expenses, and she had no savings left. She started rationing. Smaller meals, lower heat settings, fewer trips into town for supplies. It wasn't sustainable long-term, but she didn't let herself think about long-term. Just today, just getting through today. Phantom became her anchor. Every morning she'd bring him an apple or carrot, leaving it on the fence post. Every morning she'd talk to him while he listened from whatever distance he'd chosen that day. Sometimes 15 feet, sometimes 5. Never close enough to touch, but close enough that she could see the rise and fall of his breathing, the way his muscles moved beneath his scarred hide. She noticed things about him, how he'd pace the corral during windstorms as if the weather awakened something restless in him, how he'd stand perfectly still during sunrises, his head raised toward the light, how his ears would track sounds she couldn't hear, coyotes in the distance, ravens overhead, the truck approaching from miles away. "You're not really wild, are you?" she asked him one morning in late January. "Bernard didn't capture you from the wild. You chose this. You keep choosing this. Why?" The stallion watched her with those deep, intelligent eyes. If he had an answer, he wasn't sharing. February brought an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 40s pulled up in a Range Rover, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that had clearly never seen actual outdoor use. She introduced herself as Stephanie, a horse trainer from Portland who'd heard about Phantom through the network of equestrians that seemed to exist like an underground railroad. "I specialize in rehabilitation," Stephanie explained, her tone confident, bordering on condescending. "I've worked with horses others have given up on. Abuse cases mostly. I heard about your stallion and I wanted to make an offer." Abigail invited her inside for coffee, more out of habit than hospitality. The cabin looked better than it had 2 months ago, but it was still clearly a work in progress, patches of new wood next to weathered old, mismatched repairs, the bare functionality of poverty. "I'll pay you $20,000 for him," Stephanie said, getting straight to business. "I know he's been problematic, but I'm confident I can rehabilitate him. He'd live on my facility outside Portland, full veterinary care, professional training. It would be the best thing for everyone." $20,000. The number hung in the air like a lifeline. It would solve every financial problem Abigail had. It would mean stability, security, maybe even the ability to move somewhere easier, somewhere less brutal. "No!" Abigail heard herself say. Stephanie blinked. "Excuse me? He's not for sale. Mrs. Fletcher, with all due respect, you're clearly struggling here. This cabin is falling apart. You can't properly care for a horse with this animal's needs. I'm offering you a solution that helps both you and the horse." Abigail set down her coffee mug with deliberate care. 5 trainers tried to rehabilitate him. 5 trainers ended up in the hospital. What makes you think you'd be different? I have techniques they didn't. I have facility. You have arrogance. Abigail interrupted. "You have the same arrogance everyone else had. The assumption that he needs fixing, that he's broken." Stephanie's expression hardened. "Mrs. Fletcher, that horse is dangerous. He's hurt people. Leaving him in these conditions, allowing him to remain wild and aggressive, that's not compassionate. It's negligent. You should leave now." After Stephanie drove away, Abigail walked to the corral. Phantom was standing near the fence, not the fence closest to the cabin where she usually found him in the mornings, but the fence that faced the driveway, the direction Stephanie's Range Rover had taken. He was agitated, ears pinned back, tail swishing, head tossing. She'd never seen him like this. "It's okay," she called softly. "She's gone. I sent her away." The stallion's head swung toward her. For several long seconds, they looked at each other across the expanse of the corral. Then, slowly, deliberately, Phantom walked toward her. Not to the fence, to her. He crossed the corral with purposeful strides, closing the distance between them until only the fence rail separated them. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. Every survival instinct screamed at her to step back, to retreat, to remember what this horse had done to 5 trained professionals. She held her ground. Phantom stopped at the fence. This close, he was enormous, powerful. His breath steamed in the cold February air. One strike from those hooves could kill her instantly. "I know you're scared," she whispered. "I know you don't trust people. I know they've tried to force you into cages you never agreed to. I understand that, I do." The stallion's ears flicked forward. "But I'm not them," she continued. "I'm not trying to break you or train you or sell you. I'm just—" Her voice cracked. "I'm just trying to survive, same as you. And maybe we do that better together. Maybe that's enough." Phantom lowered his massive head, slowly, cautiously, until his nose was inches from her outstretched hand. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare hope. The stallion's nose touched her palm. Warm breath ghosted across her skin. He held there for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then he lifted his head and turned away, walking back toward the center of the corral. Abigail stood frozen at the fence, staring at her hand as if it had been touched by something sacred. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Something had changed. Some invisible wall had developed a crack. March arrived with the tentative promise of spring. The days grew longer, the sun warmer. Wildflowers began appearing in impossible places, tiny bursts of yellow and purple pushing through cracks in the hard desert soil. Abigail had been on the property for 4 months. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter, but something approaching a home. She'd painted the kitchen walls a warm cream color, using paint she'd found in town at a hardware store's clearance section. She'd sewn curtains from fabric scraps. Small touches that cost almost nothing, but transformed the space from derelict to lived in. Her relationship with Phantom had evolved into something she couldn't quite define. Every morning she'd bring him his apple or carrot. Most mornings he'd approach the fence. Sometimes he'd let her stand close. Once or twice he'd allowed her to touch his nose, that same gentle contact they'd shared in February. But he never let her closer, never let her inside his space. The corral remained his kingdom, and she was granted only brief audiences at the border. Clifford noticed the change. "In 12 years, I've never seen that horse willingly approach a human," he said one morning while unloading hay. "Bernard tried everything, spent a fortune on trainers. That animal's got walls around him thicker than prison. Maybe he just needed someone who wasn't trying to tear the walls down," Abigail replied. Clifford considered this, then nodded slowly. "Bernard used to say the same thing toward the end. Said maybe Phantom wasn't meant to be ridden, maybe he was just meant to be witnessed." Did Bernard ever figure out where Phantom came from? His history? Not much to tell. Caught him in the wild, up in the Steens mountain country. Phantom was about 3 years old then, already fully grown, already untouchable. Wild Mustangs. They're born knowing humans mean danger. But Phantom was different, violent almost, like something had happened before Bernard found him. That night, Abigail dreamed about wild horses running across an endless desert, and when she woke, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd glimpsed something important just beyond her understanding. April brought new financial pressure. The property taxes were due, a bill she hadn't anticipated because she'd never owned property before. The amount made her physically ill, $2,800, money she absolutely did not have. She considered calling Carolyn, begging for a loan, But her daughter had 3 kids and a mortgage of her own. She considered selling some of Philip's belongings, his tools, his fishing equipment. But the thought of letting go of those last tangible connections to him felt like amputation. She had one asset, one thing of value. At night, she'd lie awake and think about Stephanie's offer. $20,000. More than enough to pay the taxes, to repair the cabin properly, to breathe for the first time in months. All she had to do was sell Phantom. In the mornings, she'd stand at the fence and look at the stallion, at the scars on his hide, at the wildness that had never been broken, at the careful trust he'd learned to offer her in small, precious doses. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked him one morning. "I can't pay the taxes. I can't stay here without paying the taxes, and I can't sell you." "I won't sell you." Phantom approached the fence. He'd started doing this more often now, coming to her without the offering of food, just coming because... Why? She didn't know. She'd stopped trying to understand his motivations and just accepted his presence as a gift. "I'm trapped," she whispered. "Same as you, except you chose your cage. Mine was chosen for me." The solution came from an unexpected source. Clifford arrived one morning with hay and a proposition. "I've been thinking," he said. "My nephew Garrett, he runs a wilderness therapy program for at-risk kids, takes them out into the desert, teaches them survival skills, gives them space to heal away from whatever damaged them. He's been looking for a new location, someplace remote, someplace with existing infrastructure." Abigail felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. "What are you suggesting?" "Lease him the land, not the cabin. That stays yours, but the rest of the property. He'd pay you monthly, not a fortune, but enough to cover taxes and then some. Kids would come through in groups, spend a week or 2 camping, learning. They'd never bother Phantom. Corrals fenced off separate. Might actually be good for that horse to see humans who aren't trying to control him." It wasn't a perfect solution. It meant sharing the land, giving up some of the solitude she'd grown to treasure. But it also meant survival. It meant keeping Phantom. It meant staying. "Yes," she said. "Yes, tell him I'm interested." Garrett came by that weekend. He was in his 30s, bearded and sun-weathered, with the kind of calm presence that came from years spent in wild places. He walked the property with Abigail, asking questions, taking notes, treating both her and the land with respect. When he saw Phantom, he stopped. "That's the horse," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. The kids won't go near the corral. That'll be a hard boundary." "Good." Garrett turned to look at her. "Bernard was my great-uncle. I grew up hearing stories about this place, about that horse, about how something wild and beautiful shouldn't be forced into shapes it was never meant to hold." He paused. "I think Bernard would be happy knowing you're here, knowing Phantom's not alone." The lease was signed within a week. The first payment came 2 days later, and Abigail paid the property taxes with 3 hours to spare before the deadline. The first group of kids arrived in May. 6 teenagers, all boys, all carrying the kind of damage that came from broken homes and broken systems. They set up camp on the far side of the property, far from the cabin and the corral, and Abigail barely saw them for the first few days. But she heard them, laughing, arguing, living. On the 3rd night, one of the boys approached the cabin. He was tall and thin, probably 16, with the kind of defensive posture that screamed trauma. "Ma'am, Garrett said we're not supposed to go near the horse, but I wanted to ask if it's okay if I just look from a distance." "What's your name?" "Irving." "Irving, you can look all you want. Just don't try to touch him or go in the corral. He's been through enough." Irving nodded solemnly. "I get that." She watched from the window as the boy stood at the fence, 30 feet from where Phantom grazed. He didn't try to get closer. He just stood there, watching. And Phantom, for his part, seemed content to be watched. Summer in the high desert was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Temperatures climbed above 90 during the day and dropped to 50 at night. The land transformed into a palette of gold and brown and dusty green, punctuated by the occasional shock of wildflowers that somehow survived in impossible conditions. The wilderness therapy program brought new groups every 2 weeks. Abigail got to know some of the kids, not well but enough to learn their names, to hear fragments of their stories. Meredith, who'd run away from home 6 times, Zachary, who'd been in 3 foster homes before he turned 14, Priscilla, who carved words into her arms when the pain inside became too much to contain. Broken kids, beautiful kids, surviving kids. They reminded her of Phantom, wild things learning to exist in a world that had tried to cage them. Irving came back with every group rotation. Garrett had hired him as a junior counselor after seeing how well he worked with the other kids. He'd formed an attachment to Phantom, spending hours at the fence just watching the stallion, never trying to touch or control, just witnessing. "He's different than other horses," Irving said one evening in July. He and Abigail were sitting on the cabin porch watching the sun set behind the rim rock. "It's like he knows things, like he's been through something that changed him." "We've all been through things that change us," Abigail replied. "The question is whether we let those things destroy us or define us." Irving was quiet for a long moment. "Garrett told me about your husband. I'm sorry." "Thank you. Do you think it gets easier? Missing someone?" "No," she said honestly, "but you get stronger at carrying it." In August, everything changed. A massive wildfire ignited 60 miles to the southwest, sparked by lightning in drought-dried forest. Within hours, it had consumed thousands of acres. Within days, it was marching northeast, driven by high winds and fueled by decades of accumulated brush. Evacuation orders came on a Tuesday afternoon. Abigail received an automated call telling her she had 4 hours to leave. Mandatory evacuation, no exceptions. Garrett and the kids had already left. They'd been pulled out that morning when the fire was still 20 miles away. The property was deserted except for Abigail and Phantom. She stood in the cabin, staring at the few possessions she'd accumulated. She could pack her car in 30 minutes. She could be gone in an hour, safely away before the fire arrived, but she couldn't take Phantom. The horse wouldn't load into a trailer. 5 trainers had proven that. He wouldn't be led, wouldn't be halted, wouldn't cooperate with any form of transport. And there was no one to help her even if she wanted to try. The choice was impossible. Stay and potentially die, or leave and definitely abandon the horse to the flames. She walked to the corral. Smoke from the distant fire had turned the sky an apocalyptic orange. Phantom was pacing the fence line, agitated by the smell of smoke, by some ancient instinct that recognized danger. "I have to let you go," she said. Her hands shook as she approached the gate, the massive steel gate that had been locked for 12 years, keeping Phantom contained and the world out. She'd never opened it before, never even tried. But the lock was simple, just a heavy padlock that Bernard had installed years ago. Clifford had given her the key when she'd first arrived, along with strict warnings never to use it. The key turned smoothly. The lock fell open. The gate swung outward with a groan of old hinges. Phantom stopped pacing. He stood absolutely still, staring at the open gate as if it were a hallucination. Freedom. After 12 years of captivity, the barrier was gone. "Go!" Abigail urged. "Run! Get away from the fire! You know this land better than anyone. You can survive out there." The stallion didn't move. "Phantom, please. I can't watch you burn. I can't—" Her voice broke. "I've lost too much already. Please go." Phantom took 3 steps forward, not toward the gate, toward her. He crossed the distance between them with deliberate slowness, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. But Abigail stood frozen, transfixed, as this massive creature who'd never let anyone touch him walked right up to where she stood inside the corral, inside his space, his kingdom, his carefully defended territory. He lowered his head until his nose touched her chest. And there, with smoke filling the air and catastrophe marching toward them, the wild stallion who'd injured 5 trainers let a 62-year-old widow wrap her arms around his neck. She felt his heartbeat against her body, felt the warmth of him, the solid reality of muscle and bone and life, felt 12 years of walls crumbling in the space of a single moment. "I don't understand," she whispered into his mane. "Why won't you leave? You're free. The gate is open." a dub, but even as she asked, she knew, because she'd asked herself the same question 100 times. Why had she stayed in this brutal, beautiful place when she could have left? Why had she chosen isolation and struggle when easier paths existed? Because some prisons were of our own making, because some cages were chosen, because freedom wasn't always about running away. Sometimes it was about running towards something worth staying for. The wind shifted. The smell of smoke grew stronger. In the distance, she could see the orange glow of flames against the darkening sky. "We need to go," she said, "both of us, together." She'd never ridden a horse in her life, never even sat on one. But she grabbed a handful of Phantom's mane and, with more courage than skill, pulled herself onto his back. The stallion stood perfectly still as she settled onto him, her legs barely able to span his broad back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Phantom moved forward, walking out through the open gate, carrying her into the unknown. They didn't run. Phantom set a steady pace, heading northeast away from the advancing fire, away from the property, toward the high desert that spread out in endless waves of sage and stone. Behind them, the fire came. Abigail looked back once and saw flames consuming the corral, the shed, the cabin where she'd learned to survive alone. Everything she'd built in the past 8 months, gone. But she was alive, and Phantom was alive. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. They rode through the night. Phantom seemed to know where he was going, following trails invisible to Abigail's eyes, navigating by instinct or memory or some combination of both. She clung to his mane, trusting him completely because she had no other choice. When dawn broke, they were miles from the property, deep in high desert country where the fire couldn't reach. Phantom stopped beside a natural spring that bubbled up between rocks, creating a small pool of clear water. Abigail slid off his back, her legs nearly buckling from hours of riding. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she was alive. They were both alive. She drank from the spring, then splashed water on her face, washing away the smoke and ash. When she looked up, Phantom was drinking beside her, their reflections wavering together in the water's surface. "What now?" she asked, not really expecting an answer, just needing to break the silence. The answer came from an unexpected source. Her phone, which she'd forgotten was in her jacket pocket, buzzed with a text message. Somehow, out here in the middle of nowhere, she had signal. It was from Garrett. "Heard about the fire. Are you safe? Where are you?" She tried to describe her location using landmarks she could see, a distinctive rock formation, the direction of the sun, the distance they'd traveled. Within an hour, Garrett's truck appeared on a distant ridge, kicking up dust as it navigated the rough terrain. He pulled up beside the spring and got out slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. His eyes widened when he saw Phantom standing calmly beside Abigail. "You're riding him," he said, as if confirming what he was seeing was real. "I rode him, once, out of necessity. 5 professional trainers couldn't get near that horse, and you rode him out of a wildfire." Abigail looked at Phantom, who was watching Garrett with calm alertness but no aggression. "I think he saved me," she said quietly, "not the other way around." The fire had destroyed everything on the property except the well and parts of the foundation. The cabin was gone. The corral was gone. The shed was gone. All of it reduced to ash and charred timber. But the land remained. The land survived. Insurance money came through. Not much, but enough to build again. This time, Abigail had help. Garrett and the wilderness therapy kids volunteered their labor. Clifford donated materials. Even Irving, who was supposed to be focusing on his own recovery, showed up every weekend to help rebuild. They constructed a new cabin, smaller than the original, but better designed for the desert climate. They built a new shelter for Phantom, not a corral this time, but a 3-sided barn with an open front, giving him the choice to use it or not. The first night the barn was finished, Phantom walked inside and stood there, protected from the wind, voluntarily accepting shelter for the first time in 12 years. "He's not wild anymore," Irving observed, watching from a safe distance. "He was never really wild," Abigail replied. "He was just waiting for someone to understand the difference between breaking and befriending." Autumn came. The wilderness therapy program resumed, now with additional structures that Garrett had built, a main lodge, sleeping cabins, a kitchen facility. The property had transformed from a place of isolation to a place of healing. Abigail never tried to ride Phantom again. She didn't need to. Their relationship had evolved beyond the traditional boundaries of horse and human. He was her companion, her reminder that survival sometimes looked like stubbornness, and that freedom sometimes meant choosing your own cage. On cool mornings, she'd walk to the barn with an apple or carrot. Phantom would emerge from the shadows, would let her touch his nose, would stand beside her while she talked about Philip or the kids, or whatever thoughts were weighing on her heart. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the stallion would rest his massive head on her shoulder, and they'd stand together in comfortable silence, two survivors who'd found unexpected sanctuary in the high desert and in each other. 2 years later, the property had become something Bernard might not recognize, but would certainly appreciate. The wilderness therapy program was thriving, helping dozens of at-risk kids every year. The new cabin was filled with the kind of warmth that came from regular use and genuine care, and Phantom, the wild stallion who'd injured 5 trainers, had become an unexpected symbol of the program's mission. The kids weren't allowed in the barn, but they could watch from a distance. They could see the massive black stallion who'd chosen to stay, who'd let his walls down just enough to accept companionship while maintaining his essential wildness. "He's like us," Meredith had said during one session, staring at Phantom from the fence line. "Damaged but not broken, scared but still here." Garrett had incorporated Phantom into the program's philosophy. The horse became a living lesson. You don't heal by being forced into someone else's idea of what healing looks like. You heal by being given space, respect, and time to find your own path. Abigail, now 64, had found a purpose she'd never anticipated. She worked part-time with the program, not as a therapist, she had no training for that, but as a presence. Someone who'd survived loss and isolation and come out the other side changed but intact. Sometimes kids would ask her advice. She'd tell them about Philip, about the grief, about the financial devastation that had brought her here. She'd tell them about Phantom, about the night they'd fled the fire together. "Were you scared?" they'd ask. "Terrified," she'd answer honestly. But fear and bravery aren't opposites. Bravery is being terrified and doing the thing anyway. Irving had become a full-time employee of the program. He'd gotten his GED, enrolled in community college, was studying social work. He credited Phantom with his transformation, though Abigail suspected he'd done the work himself. The horse had just been a mirror, showing Irving his own capacity for patience and connection. On a clear October morning, Abigail received a call from Carolyn. Her daughter was planning to visit for Thanksgiving, bringing the grandchildren. It would be the first time they'd seen the property, the first time they'd meet Phantom. "Mum, are you happy?" Carolyn asked. "Really happy? Because you know you can still come live with us. The offer stands." Abigail looked out the window at the barn, where Phantom was visible in the entrance, his dark shape silhouetted against the morning light. "I'm happy," she said, and meant it. That evening she walked to the barn, as she did every evening. Phantom emerged from the shadows, greeting her with the soft nicker he'd developed over the past 2 years. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the scars that had never faded, but somehow seemed less prominent now. "We've come a long way," she told him. "Both of us." The stallion pressed his nose against her palm, a gesture of affection he'd learned to offer freely. His eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that had once held only wariness and pain, now held something else. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. The kind of hard-won peace that came from surviving and finding that survival was worth the effort. In the distance, Abigail could hear the kids from the latest group laughing around a campfire. Garrett's voice rising above the others, telling stories. The sound of life being lived by people who'd almost given up on living. She'd come here with nothing. No money, no prospects, no hope. She'd found a broken-down cabin and a dangerous horse and land that seemed cursed by isolation. But she'd also found something unexpected, proof that endings could become beginnings, that the places where we break can become the foundations we build on, that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of, solitude, wildness, the complete unknown, turns out to be exactly what you needed. "Thank you," she whispered to Phantom, "for the shelter when she'd had nowhere to go, for the companionship when she'd been drowning in loneliness, for being wild enough to remind her that survival didn't mean surrendering who you were at your core." The stallion leaned into her touch, and together they watched the sun set over the high desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, the ongoing work of survival. But tonight, standing beside the horse who taught her that even the wildest hearts could choose connection, Abigail Fletcher felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt home. Some stories end with everything tied up neatly. The hero conquers their demons, solves all their problems, rides off into a perfect sunset. This isn't that kind of story. Abigail still struggled with money sometimes. The property still demanded constant repairs and attention. And Phantom, despite the transformation in their relationship, remained fundamentally wild, a creature who'd chosen proximity to humans without ever becoming fully domesticated. But that was the point. Healing wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about learning to live with who you'd become after the world had changed you. The lonely widow who'd taken shelter on forgotten land hadn't fixed the wild horse that injured 5 trainers. She'd simply understood him. She'd given him the one thing no one else had thought to offer: acceptance without conditions, space to be exactly what he was. And in return, he'd given her the same gift. Sometimes redemption isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just 2 damaged souls finding each other in the middle of nowhere and deciding that broken can be beautiful, that scars tell stories worth telling. That survival, in whatever form it takes, is always an act of defiance and courage. If you're facing your own wilderness right now, if you're alone in a place you never chose, dealing with things that feel impossible, wondering if you're strong enough to keep going, I want you to know something. You are. You're strong enough. Not because strength means never falling apart, but because strength means putting yourself back together in a new shape when the old one no longer fits. Abigail and Phantom taught me that, and I hope their story teaches you too. What's your story? What wilderness are you navigating? Drop a comment below with your city. I read them all, and your story matters. If this moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances. Remember, even the wildest hearts can find home.